Donald Trump thought he'd written the rulebook for this trade war with Canada. Tariffs, threats, sudden executive orders, 25% on almost everything crossing the border, 10% on Canadian energy, all justified under national security in the fentanyl crisis. But while Trump was throwing punches, Mark Carney was doing something more dangerous. He was writing a new playbook, a playbook built around three big moves. Stop relying on the US, build a real escape route for Canadian oil. Use Trump's own chaos to push Canada into the rest of the world. Tonight on Huge Press Room, we're going to break down 3 ways Carney is quietly outsmarting Trump in this trade war, and what it means if you live in Canada, work in the States, or just want to understand who's really winning this fight. You're watching Huge Press Room. If you want more deep dives into Trump versus Canada, tariff wars, and the real power games behind the headlines, hit subscribe, drop a like, and let's get into it. Let's start where this whole mess really begins. On the 1st of February 2025, at the start of his second non-consecutive term, Donald Trump signed 3 executive orders. With one signature, he slapped an extra 25% tariff on almost all goods from Canada and Mexico, and 10% on imports from China. The only partial exception? Canadian oil and energy. Those would only be hit with a 10% tariff. He didn't do this using the normal trade rules inside the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. He went around USMCA completely, using a Cold War-era law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, declaring that illegal immigration and fentanyl were an extraordinary threat to national security. In plain English, Trump used emergency powers meant for war and terrorism to tax Canadian lumber, steel, cars, cheese, you name it. For years, Canada's economy has been welded to the United States. Around 3/4 of Canadian exports go south. More than 95% of its oil exports have historically gone to one customer, America. So when Trump throws 25% tariffs on almost everything, it doesn't just annoy Ottawa, it freezes investment. Companies delay new factories, exporters pause expansion, and everyone wonders, what if he raises it again next month? Carney looked at that and basically said, the decades-long process of getting more and more dependent on the US is over. That's the heart of his new playbook. And move number 1 is simple to say, brutal to execute. Stop treating the United States as Canada's only option. In October 2025, Carney gave a speech where he laid out a number that should scare Washington more than any angry tweet. He said Canada will double its non-US exports in the next decade, not diversify a bit, not open up some new markets on the side. Double? Why? Because in his own words, American tariffs are causing a chill in investment, and Canadians can't rely on the US the way they used to. So what does double non-US exports actually look like in the real world? It looks like new trade missions and deals with countries Trump complains about on Twitter: China, India, Southeast Asia, Europe, Mexico, but as partners, not just co-victims. Just in the last weeks and months, Carney's government has moved to restart trade talks with India after a 2-year diplomatic freeze, aiming to double Canada-India trade to $50 billion by 2030. He's been in South Korea, Indonesia, and the broader Indo-Pacific talking about investment, supply chains, and infrastructure. He's opening doors again in China, despite years of tensions over espionage, 5G, and detained citizens. If you zoom out, a picture emerges. On one side, you have Trump saying, "Pay us more or we'll tax everything you sell us." On the other, you have Carney basically replying, "Cool story, we'll find other people to sell to." This doesn't crush the impact of tariffs overnight, but every trade mission, every new agreement, every factory built to make EV parts for Europe or Asia instead of Michigan, weakens Washington's grip a little bit more. The risk, of course, is obvious. If Canada replaces dependence on one big partner, the US, with dependence on another, like China or India, it might just be trading one set of problems for another. Analysts are already warning that Beijing and New Delhi have both used trade as a weapon before. But as far as the Trump versus Carney chessboard goes, this is Carney's move 1. Pull Canada's economy out of Trump's shadow by making sure the US is no longer the only game in town. Move 2 is more concrete, more controversial, and a lot more explosive. Build a physical escape route for Canadian oil. On 27th November 2025, Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith signed a Memorandum of Understanding in Toronto. The idea is support a brand new pipeline that would move up to 1 million barrels of oil a day from Alberta's oil sands to a port on the Pacific coast in British Columbia, where it could be shipped to Asia. Not theoretically, not someday. The MOU sets deadlines, a proposal to the Federal Major Projects Office by July, potential construction as early as 2029, private companies like Enbridge or TC Energy being courted to actually build it. Why does that matter in a Trump trade war? Remember, more than 95% of Canada's oil exports have gone to the US for years. When you have one main buyer, that buyer has leverage. They can threaten tariffs, quotas, or national security reviews and know you'll feel it. A serious pipeline to the Pacific is basically Canada saying, if you keep taxing us, we'll sell our oil somewhere else, and we'll build the pipe to do it. The deal is paired with a huge carbon capture project, the 16.5 billion Canadian dollars Pathways Alliance plan, and commitments to net zero by 2050, more nuclear power, electrification, and even infrastructure for AI data centers. Carney's message is, we can be an energy superpower and a climate player at the same time. The reaction? Alberta and the oil industry cheered. Investors started looking carefully at whether the numbers add up. Environmental groups accused Carney of selling out his climate credentials. British Columbia's premier, David Eby, blasted the plan as violating a crude tanker ban from 2018 and warned that his province isn't on board. Indigenous groups and coastal First Nations raised red flags about spills, rights, and lack of real consultation. And Stephen Guilbeault, longtime environmentalist and high-profile cabinet minister, resigned over Carney's broader energy shift, calling it a betrayal of climate promises. So why take this risk? Because from Carney's point of view, this is the only way to turn the trade war into leverage against Trump. As long as US refiners know Canada has no easy way to get oil to anyone else, they can buy Canadian crude at a discount, support tariffs because they'll still get supply, and assume Canada will always come back to the table. A Pacific pipeline changes that calculus. Now imagine being a refinery in the US Midwest watching this unfold. You see, tariffs adding 10% cost on Canadian energy. Your main supplier planning to ship 1 million barrels a day to Asia instead. At some point, you're not just mad at Canada. You're mad at Washington for making your supply more expensive and less reliable. That's the pressure Carney wants. Not just Ottawa begging Trump to lift tariffs, but Trump's own business allies calling the White House asking, why are you pushing Canada away? That's move 2, build steel and concrete leverage. Move 3 is more subtle, but just as ruthless. Stop panicking at every Trump threat and start using them. If you've watched Trump's politics for a while, you know his pattern. Threaten maximum pain, enjoy the headlines, sometimes deliver, sometimes quietly back down later. The trade war with Canada has followed that script almost perfectly. He announced 25% tariffs on almost all Canadian imports, 10% on energy. He paused them for 30 days after Canada and Mexico agreed to ramp up border security, then let them take effect anyway. He later threatened to increase Canada's special fentanyl tariff rate by another 10 percentage points, pushing some goods close to 45% duties. Early on, Canadian businesses and politicians reacted to every tweet as if the sky were falling. Investment froze. The dollar shuddered. Opponents accused the government of not doing enough, or doing too much, or doing the wrong thing. But as 2025 went on, something shifted in Carney's public tone. Instead of promising to fix Trump, he started talking about making Canada less vulnerable to whatever Trump does next. Think about the difference. One strategy says, we'll negotiate a better deal with Trump and get back to normal. The other says, there is no normal anymore. Our job is to build an economy that survives whoever sits in the White House. That change in mindset shows up in policy. Rather than scramble to get exemptions from tariffs, Carney is investing in trade diversification. India, China, Southeast Asia, even if that annoys Washington. Instead of treating tariffs as temporary noise, his government is rebuilding Canada's industrial strategy around the assumption that the U.S. will remain erratic and protectionist. He uses Trump's threats politically at home. Look at what America is doing. This is why we need our own plan, our own markets, our own infrastructure. In other words, every time Trump shouts, "I'll raise tariffs again," Carney points at it and says, "Exactly. That's why we're changing everything." It's a judo move. You don't stop the punch, you use its momentum to justify reforms that would have been politically impossible a few years ago. Of course, this isn't cost-free. Businesses still pay those tariffs. Consumers still feel higher prices. Analysts estimate the Trump tariffs amount to something like an extra $1,200 a year per U.S. household in 2025, and Canada feels the pain on its side too. But Carney's bet is long-term. If he can survive the short-term damage and build a more diversified, less U.S.-dependent economy, then Trump's trademark bullying loses power because the target just isn't as exposed anymore. That's move 3. Stop being reactive, start being structural. So is Carney really outsmarting Trump in this trade war, or is he just playing a different game? On Trump's scoreboard, the metrics are simple. Tariffs imposed, allies humiliated, base excited, enemies punished. On Carney's scoreboard, the metrics are longer term. How much of Canada's trade still depends on the U.S.? How fast can Canada build physical routes, pipelines, ports, rail, to other markets? How many investors believe Canada can still be a safe, stable place to put their money while the U.S. swings from one crisis to another? Right now, we're somewhere in the middle of the story. Trump has inflicted real economic pain on Canada, but he's also given Carney the perfect political excuse to rip up the old economic model and build a new one, faster than anyone thought was possible. If the plan works, Canada in 10 years could be less dependent on the U.S., better connected to Asia and India, still a major energy exporter, but with new routes and new buyers, and more resilient to whoever sits in the Oval Office. If it fails, Canada risks getting stuck in the worst of both worlds. A bruised relationship with the U.S., a pipeline bogged down in lawsuits and protests, trade deals that never quite deliver, and a climate reputation damaged enough to anger voters without actually stopping the rise in emissions. So I'll leave you with this. Is Mark Carney playing 3D chess while Trump plays checkers? Or is he gambling Canada's climate, alliances, and political stability on a plan that might never fully materialize? Is this a smart long-term escape from Trump's tariff trap? Or just a very elegant way of saying, we don't know how to stop the pain, so we'll try to outrun it? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you haven't seen them yet, we already have 2 connected videos here on Huge Press Room. One on Carney's pipeline revolt, the mega project meant to break Trump's energy leverage, and one on the Reagan TV ad that made Trump explode and shut down all trade talks with Canada. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next chapter of this story. Thanks for watching Huge Press Room. I'll see you in the next one.